On today's Locked On Cavs, there are even more head coaching names in the mix for the Cleveland Cavaliers, and we're going to dive into every single one of them and figure out who can make the final cut alongside yesterday's show's frontrunner, Kenny Atkinson.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to Locked On Cavs. How you doing? How you doing? Come on in and sit on down since we're about to dive in and learn more and discuss a head coaching candidate I think would be great for the Cavs and former Charlotte head coach and current New Orleans Pelicans associate head coach James Borrego. But before we do that, just want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA, all one word, for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So, James Borrego. Sure, his overall record as a head coach may not inspire too much confidence since he was, 138 and 163 in 4 years of the Hornets and never made the playoffs. Barely missed a play-in, if I remember correctly off the top of my head. But if you look past the numbers, there is some reason for optimism and why, at least in my opinion, why Borrego makes sense as a possible and pretty serious head coaching candidate for the Cavs. In his final 3 seasons of the Hornets, they ended with a winning record every single year and always were either in the mix for the playoffs or the play-in race. And whether it was the change in ownership or Michael Jordan, who was the owner of the Hornets, or governor, I guess is the proper term, of the Hornets at the time, meddling in the affairs of Charlotte's front office, a lot of people, myself included, were pretty surprised that Borrego was fired by Charlotte. But again, if you look into the numbers, even in his final season, the Hornets ranked 4th in the league in points per game and 9th in offensive rating. That kind of checks out to one of the top offenses overall in the league. And if you consider the fact that that was without LaMelo Ball for the majority of that season, and the Hornets were running point with a 33-year-old Ish Smith and Isaiah Thomas that the Hornets signed off of the street on a couple 10-day deals and then the remainder of the regular season, I think that could give you a little bit of optimism considering that the Cavs aren't dealing with more of a child in LaMelo Ball, who's pretty immature comparatively, like Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell, and also just the pure talent. Like there is a gulf between, Ball, Smith, and a hobbled Isaiah Thomas combined to comparatively to a tandem of Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell, or just Darius Garland by himself, or the two of them together. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can mix and match and plug and play these options. But after his ouster in Charlotte, funnily and curiously enough, he rejoined or re-entered NBA coaching with the team that used to be known as the Hornets, but now known as the Pelicans, and built an offense that was centralized around Zion Williamson, CJ McCollum, and Brandon Ingram. And I think that alone is pretty resume furthering, building, I guess, if you want to put it that way. But like the Pelicans had the 22nd to they were a bottom third offensive team before Borrego showed up, and then when Borrego arrives, sure, health played a part, especially for Williamson and I mean all of them, Ingram and McCollum too. But the fact that like the Pelicans vaulted from bottom third to top 10 in the league in offense can't be understated, and I think really could be something creative and fun here if the Cavs were to hire Borrego and build an offense around like Evan Mobley as a central focus, who going forward should be the central focus for this team. And I'm not saying he's, as in Mobley, on the same level as Zion Williamson, but I think there is some just reason for optimism and hope that James Borrego could get the Cavs in the place they need to be offensively, because Mobley would be the central focus on the offense, with Donovan Mitchell being a much more souped-up version of what CJ McCollum gave the Pelicans this season. And then, I mean, God willing, the Cavs could trade for Brandon Ingram this offseason as well, and that really changes the trajectory of things. But if you have a head coach that is familiar with coaching Ingram, how to maximize Ingram's opportunities and success on offense in Ingram, The last few playoff games notwithstanding, of course, it doesn't speak for the entire body of work for either Borrego or Ingram, but I think there is something really interesting and intriguing there, and he just kind of fits that mold of every coaching candidate that has a similar offensive style, where the Cavs seem to be looking at candidates that are more offensive focused. I think aren't completely hapless defensively and are able to scheme up a competent NBA defense and counterbalance some of what the offensive juice and firepower they bring to the table is. But in like Borrego's case, his teams on offense play with pace, space, and efficiency, which is just a recurring and very common theme for the Cavs. And I think that's just kind of makes it a little bit more exciting because he's young, he's in that Popovichian tree, which it's not apples to apples with Mike Budenholzer, but it's a similar vein to an offensive-minded assistant from Greg Popovich's disciplined tree that is going to instill his system and his offense and his flow. And if he's able to do that in Cleveland, him as in Borrego, I think that could be a very fun and exciting option for the Cavs, and also just would likely help their chances in maintaining a firm grip on keeping Donovan Mitchell in free agency, getting him to sign that extension, I should say, rather, and not have to deal with any of the standing offers, whether it's from the Brooklyn Nets or the Miami Heat, the Los Angeles Lakers, God, even the New York Knicks could be an option too. But that's neither here nor there. I feel very comfortable in saying that Donovan Mitchell likely will resign with the Cavs. Don't know the limit of the capacity. It's been reported and heard to myself that the Cavs are looking to offer a 4-year, $208.5 million contract extension. But James Borrego does make a lot of sense. It might not be the sexiest or the splashiest hire, and we'll talk about a pretty sexy and splashy hire that the Cavs could consider in former Villanova head coach Jay Wright much later in the show, and more soon on Johnnie Bryant, a coach that has a very strong relationship with Donovan Mitchell as well. But just focusing on the Borrego aspect of it, I think it could be a pretty solid upgrade for the Cavs. It's not the offensive version of JB Bickerstaff. If you're able to assemble the right coaching staff around him as well, maybe handle the responsibilities of keeping their finger on the pulse of the locker room, because that was something that was reported in his time of the end of his time in Charlotte, that Borrego had lost the locker room, but it's tough when you're dealing with two pretty unprofessional professionals in Miles Bridges and LaMelo Ball, but neither here nor there. I think that is something definitely worth keeping an eye on, keeping tabs on. And I'm personally, if you were to tell me right now that James Borrego and Kenny Atkinson were your two finalists heading into the end of Cleveland's coaching search, that means the Cavs are likely doing this head coaching search right. I could be wrong too. There's a reason why I'm behind a mic in front of a camera instead of running the day-to-day operations of an NBA organization. But just from this outsider looking in, just how teams play and how Borrego is kind of able to maximize opportunity and talent, whether it's not having a center at all in Charlotte and unhealthy star point guard play, which turns to veterans, Borrego's able to squeeze blood from a stone and really maximize offensive opportunities for a team. And I think, again, I don't want to say it's apples to apples with Mike Budenholzer, but I know a lot of folks in our comments and a lot of folks in our mentions and a lot of folks just in general were, whenever JB had a shortcoming this last season, Mike Budenholzer is the name that was constantly dropped. And again, not the same thing. I don't think they're the same person in terms of coaching style or approach, but there could be some similarities to how both these coaches are Greg Popovich disciples that are former assistants that are offensively focused, and that could have some real success for the Cavs overall, because they need a coach that has that stronger offensive identity. But speaking of coaches with an offensive identity, we will talk more about another head coaching candidate that I think could be a finalist, especially depending on some guys we discussed yesterday that I'm not super jazzed about. And speaking of Jazz, it's former Utah Jazz assistant Johnnie Bryant. But more on that in a second, because I got to give you a quick word from today's first sponsor, Gametime. As I had mentioned before, today's episode of Locked on Cavs is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of the NBA, which makes getting playoff tickets even faster and easier. game prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to tip off, which only helps you, the fan, enjoy the game for less and on your schedule. With killer last minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. Personally, what I love most about Gametime is all the goodies that comes with it, including flash deals, which allow you to save even more of the exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or current event. All-in pricing, which you can toggle that feature to show you the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout, so you know what you're paying. And the best one of all, Gametime ticket coverage, which means your purchase is covered by the ticketing industry's most flexible customer service policy, no questions asked. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with Gametime. Just download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA, that's LOCKEDONNBA, for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Welcome back to Locked On Cavs, your number one podcast covering all things Cleveland Cavaliers. And while you're getting your fill in on this show, I got to ask, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day when you work from home? Do you have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch today to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that is programmed for your everyday to bring you the biggest stories without all that screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you the can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news. Streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the new free Amazon Fire TV Channels app, which is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, which features your team, as I had mentioned it, folks, every single day. So, fellow Jazz man Donovan Mitchell, or former, I should say, Jazz man Donovan Mitchell, has a pretty strong connection with former Jazz man and Jazz assistant coach, current New York Knicks associate head coach Johnnie Bryant, which is something that I reported for Right Down Euclid, where you can find all my written Cleveland Cavaliers coverage that is free and accessible to everyone. We're a nonprofit news org, so support us today. But Bryant is going to be among the coaches that will be considered by Cleveland during its coaching search. And for resume-wise, Bryant was a part of those Jazz teams that really made a lot of heyday in the regular season, then kind of came up short in the NBA playoffs. And then more recently, Bryant's been with the Knicks for the last 4 years, actually survived a lot of coaching change and has emerged as one of Tom Thibodeau's top assistants, actually the top assistant, and is viewed by many, if Thibs were never to consider retirement or, never sign an extension, that would be the successor to Tom Thibodeau in New York. But with New York's success, I think Thibodeau's coaching staff is going to start to get poached, and Bryant could be a guy who finds his way to Cleveland because, like I mentioned before, he has a existing relationship with Donovan Mitchell. He's actually known as Donovan Mitchell's personal player development coach, which I think is incredibly monumental if you are in the sweepstakes or mindset that the Cavs are going to do their darndest to keep Mitchell however they can this offseason by signing him to that lucrative max extension and just keeping him long term. And if you're able to get his, one of his closest companions and coaches from his time in Utah and Brian, I think that's a one way to leg it up and do it better. And also, interestingly enough, before Mitchell arrived, Bryant had a pretty strong relationship with soon-to-be free agent forward Gordon Hayward, who, during his exit interviews, while with the Oklahoma City Thunder, was pretty clearly frustrated with how he was utilized and how he was played in OKC, and kind of made it clear that he was looking to get a more defined role. And I don't think Hayward is worth the $33 million he's making now, but if the Cavs wanted to commit some of their mid-level exception, and actually speaking of committing the mid-level exception, we'll have more on that for Thursday's show where I hop in solo on Cleveland's roster improvement options. But if you were to bring Bryant into the fold, one, that makes Donovan Mitchell happy, but two, that could open a path to obtaining Gordon Hayward, which, injuries aside and maybe some of just the weirdness of his career ever since his ankle took a full 180 in his first game as a Boston Celtic in Cleveland, funnily enough, Hayward does scratch a couple of the boxes or tick some of the boxes, I should say, where he is that combo forward player that is able to play the four a little bit in smaller ball lineups. He wouldn't start, obviously, but I think he would get a more consistent role off the bench. I think He gives you playmaking. He gives you the outside shooting, which is definitely beneficial. There's the rebounding there too. And if bringing in Bryant as the head coach does that, that could be kind of a win to help you just in the free agency recruiting battle to just kind of maximize the opportunities and potential surrounding Donovan Mitchell and maybe Gordon Hayward, but most importantly, Donovan Mitchell and Evan Mobley. But I had mentioned this on yesterday's show. If you were to bring in like a first time head coach like Bryant, and I'll be talking about two other first time NBA head coaching candidates in Alex Jensen and Jay Wright coming up, but I think this is just kind of a broad stroke approach in general. You likely want to slot a guy in as the associate head coach or a guy that is one of the lead assistants that does have some of that former NBA coaching experience or just head coaching pedigree. And I think if you were to bring in Bryant, like a guy like Terry Stotts would make a lot of sense as a handsomely paid lead assistant head coach or associate head coach, not to send a message to Bryant that, let's say, like, hey, Terry was the finalist for the position as well, but they went with Johnnie over Terry. It's more so the fact that, like, the Cavs are doing this to solidify their position, keeping Mitchell long term, maybe bringing in other free agency options as well. Empowering Bryant to have success as a coach, though, is kind of more the methodology behind any team putting like a first time head coach and not throwing them into a fire that isn't a rebuild to kind of build upon momentum and success organically by having a coaching staff surrounding that head coach that, again, just empowers the head coach, the new time head coach, to just kind of have experience. And then if, like, let's just say, hypothetically speaking, Kobe Altman sticks true to his word, the Cavs don't blow anything up, they keep Darius Garland despite maybe a possible trade request, and Donovan Mitchell signed in long term. If you're able to bring in Bryant, which sells the deal on Mitchell, but then you bring in Stotts to find an offense and cook up an offense that is conducive to having Garland and Mitchell playing in harmony, you start to see a bit of a clearer path on how this head coaching search can shape up and how this overall just like, weird, awkward transition time for the Cavs can really just start to come to a head, kind of crystallize all together. And just hiring Bryant starts to just make a little bit more sense if you're just able to flesh out the rest of your staff. Obviously, avoid a situation like what Stotts had to deal with in Milwaukee last year with Adrian Griffin, and vilifying some Bucks fans and saying that Stotts was right to leave, especially after Griffin, was fired midseason for Doc Rivers. But just more importantly, I think you want to maximize the opportunities to support your head coach. I think that's why you saw the Cavs try this approach with David Blatt, but they hired Ty Lue, their runner-up in the conversation, also just like a highly regarded assistant head coach, but also made him an associate head coach and paid him as such. Or when you look at John Beilein, like you wanted to have guys with experience, and on that coaching staff, JB Bickerstaff was John Beilein's lead man at the associate head coach position, and right-hand man, I should say, instead. And we all know how that ended. Bickerstaff took over, but it makes sense. I'm not saying like you're doing it because it's a contingency plan for Bryant's downfall, but it's more so the fact that the Cavs are just giving the coach, the first time coach, and let's say Johnnie Bryant, more time or more opportunities to succeed because he's able to lean on his assistants to maybe help the small tactical things that maybe are hard to manage or sometimes you miss, just because that's part of human nature. And also it is overwhelming to go from a longtime assistant coach to a first time head coach. But if that's the game you're willing to play, it's a name I reported again almost more than 2 weeks ago at this point, and could just be a guy that makes a lot of sense for the Cavs, especially if their public confidence isn't as confident internally in keeping Donovan Mitchell, and you really just want to seal the deal and get Mitchell to re-up with you early on into a possible extension period. Bryant could be a guy that makes a lot of sense. But speaking of guys that make a lot of sense and have that Utah connection, I think former Canton Charge head coach, Dallas Mavericks currently assistant, and former Utah Jazz assistant who has a connection with Donovan Mitchell, Alex Jensen, can make a lot of sense. More on him in a sec. So we are back for this last little portion of Locked On Cavs, and we're going to talk a little bit more about two coaching candidates. I think one a lot more serious than the other, but one both still considerable nonetheless. In Alex Jensen and Jay Wright. But let's talk with Jensen first. Back in 2019, when the Cavs hired John Beilein, who eventually was taken over by GB Bickerstaff, Jensen was a coaching candidate and I believe a finalist in 2019. And then he also just had an existing relationship with the organization on top of that. Jensen served as the head coach of the Canton Charge from 2011 to 2013. The then NBA D League affiliate of the Cavs before they became the G League. And Jensen also won NBA D League Coach of the Year in 2013, leading them to 30 wins, the second most in the franchise's history. And he also owned a overall record of 57-43 and a 4-5 postseason record during his tenure. And interestingly enough, he oversaw the development of three players to earn an NBA call-up in power forward Kevin Jones, played with the Cavs, forward Allen Anderson, who played with the Toronto Raptors, and then the Manimal himself, who got two call-ups under Jensen, and Manny Harris. But after his time in Canton came to a close, or rather he found a bigger assistant coaching opportunity, he spent years coaching the Utah Jazz alongside Quinn Snyder, which clearly translates to a relationship with Donovan Mitchell from their time together in Utah. And I think that just would be beneficial for the Cavs if you have a guy that is familiar with Mitchell and understands how he ticks. But Jensen was just considered an integral part of Utah's coaching staff and was a huge part in why the Jazz had the NBA's best record during the 2020-21 season, behind, of course, the offense spearheaded by Donovan Mitchell. But I don't want to call it a pet project, but something Jensen had a huge development in part in developing in Rudy Gobert in the 3-time Defensive Player of the Year awards Gobert has won. And speaking of Gobert, Jensen has been highly credited and widely regarded by Gobert in his development, and the same can be said for Utah Jazz man Walker Kessler, which maybe that's why Kessler had a bit of a sophomore slump after Jensen left Utah to join Jason Kidd's coaching staff with the Dallas Mavericks. But you're seeing the fruit of Jensen's labor in the Western Conference Finals currently, where although the Mavericks are up 3-0, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Jensen played a huge part in helping develop Derek Lively II from a rookie to kind of a defensive phenom that has been a spell that the Wolves, especially Jensen's former pupil and Rudy Gobert and also Karl Anthony Towns, just can't seem to unlock or figure out. And if you're the Cavs and you look at this team and like Evan Mobley is the figurehead leading you into the future, even if Donovan Mitchell sticks around long term, like having a guy like Jensen who already has an existing relationship with the Cavs organization could be an invaluable pickup, and probably will be an invaluable pickup, because Evan Mobley has the potential to be an all-defensive player every single year. He has the potential to be a defensive player of the year candidate every single year, similarly to a Rudy Gobert. And maybe under Jensen's tutelage and just guidance, he could really grow into that phenom personally. And also just Jensen can turn up the screws and tighten things up defensively, and the Cavs maintain that defensive first approach. But like I said before, this is maybe an opportunity where you bring in other assistants that can provide more of that offensive coordinating and passive advice, and just not have Jensen looking over his back constantly, thinking that he's coaching for his life and job out there, but just a support structure that allows him to succeed, with Jensen just being the focus of, okay, he has a relationship with Donovan. I think that's going to be helpful for us if you're the Cavs and keeping Donovan long term, but really committing to the idea of developing Evan Mobley, which is something I didn't touch on Monday's show, but something that Kobe Altman admitted kind of fell to the wayside during Mobley's third season, and something that needs to be a priority and primary focus going forward. And getting one of the best big men development coaches in the league currently in Alex Jensen would not be a bad place to start. But you guys might think I'm crazy. I kind of first suggested it as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke, but the more you think about it, it kind of makes sense, especially after making my argument. But the final guy I think that the folks or myself or just anyone really should probably keep tabs on for the Cavs is former Villanova head coach and multi-time national championship winning head coach Jay Wright. Yeah, I wrote down, actually, this is mostly in jest since Wright has been retired since 2022, but did reportedly flirt with the idea of coaching the Sixers in 2009, which would have been Andre Iguodala in his prime, and would have been a weird time before they went with Doug Collins as the head coach, and just a weird inverse and what if in general. But he ended up sticking with Villanova, and considering how his career went since then, probably the right call. But it's been reported by some teams, and just like, or not some teams rather, but some reporters, just like that teams have fielded their interest in Wright coaching their team before because he has that big time personality because he coached or revived rather a pedigree blue blood program in Villanova and made them a consistent championship winning caliber team, and can certainly manage the egos with his personality and also kind of know how to press the buttons from his time on Team USA and working with NBA players to just manage the egos and strong personalities that come with the NBA, especially a team that is much more star laden with Donovan Mitchell and Evan Mobley and whatever other pieces that the Cavs may have around them, whether that's Darius Garland and Jared Allen or a trade out for those guys for something else. But and this is where it kind of makes a little bit the most sense to me is the fact that it's no secret that Dan Gilbert, the governor, owner of the Cavs, has always wanted a college coach, a big name college coach rather. That means like Keith Dambrot's not coaching this team unless, he really wanted to make that LeBron pitch. But Google Keith Dambrot's time before Akron and you'll know why I'm kind of exasperated. But either way, like the Dan Gilbert has tried to court reportedly Tom Izzo, John Calipari, I would assume Jay Wright as well, Mike Krzyzewski out of Duke, like a lot of those big name, big time coaches, with Izzo being the biggest because Gilbert's a Michigan State alumni. He is one of the wealthiest NBA owners, so much so in fact that he's such a big benefactor for Michigan State's basketball team that last time I checked, they were the Michigan State Spartans presented by Rocket Mortgage. So that goes to show you how much, money could be thrown around and maybe pull Jay Wright out of retirement. But, it did fail last time with John Beilein. It failed in pretty spectacular fashion. It gave the Cavs some stability, though, because the aftershock of Beilein's resignation did give you J.B. Bickerstaff for 5 years, which gave you steadiness, which is something the Cavs did not have after dealing with the ouster of Ty Lue, Larry Drew's time as the voice of the team, and then John Beilein's brief stint as coach. But maybe with Jay Wright, it'll be different. Maybe that'll be the balm the Cavs need and the completely out of left field hiring that the Cavs could pursue to succeed JB Bickerstaff as the next head coach, to take over and guide this team with Donovan Mitchell and Evan Mobley assumedly as the central focus of this team. And yeah, but it's we can joke all we want, but it's worth keeping tabs on. I think just looking at this list compared to yesterday's list, between yesterday's list of Kenny Atkinson, Terry Stotts, and Dave Yeager compared to James Borrego, Johnnie Bryant, Alex Jensen, and Jay Wright. If you had to give me a top five of all these guys you dove into, it's likely Atkinson, Borrego. I'd put Bryant at 2 or 3. And then Alex Jensen. And then after that, it's the field. So, I didn't talk about Sam Cassell, but he could be a guy who is joining the Lakers coaching staff, whether that is as the head coach or JJ Redick's lead assistant. But if Redick is hired, of course, by the Lakers. But, yeah, I think the Cavs are going to do their due diligence no matter what when it comes to the head coaching position. They'll do whatever it takes to make sure that they find the right coach to make Donovan Mitchell happy. And if that means Jay Wright, if that means Johnnie Bryant, if that means Evan Dammarell, that's right, me, gets the call up to coach this team. Not all heroes wear capes. Sometimes they wear team-issued sweat gear on the sidelines, or if the possible reporting I saw is true, having to wear custom suits every night on the sidelines to go coach the Cavs. That's a sacrifice I'm willing to make for you, the listeners. But on our way out, I first wanted to thank you all for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. And I also wanted to remind everyone that Locked On has again launched the first ever 24/7 streaming channel, Locked On Sports Today. It is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that's programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the fuss. Locked On Sports Today brings you the can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, it's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, which features your team every day.